Hello, everyone. My name is John Kim, and I have with me...
Hey, nice to meet you. My name's Josiah Kish. John, good to be with you.
So good to be with you. This is our associate pastor in our Lexington campus. And also, for today, he is our resident Ezekiel expert.
Yeah, that's right. No more questions with Ezekiel. I fully understand it.
Well, it's because, so, true confession. I finished seminary, like 6-7 years ago. And if I'm being honest, I don't know if this is really shameful or not, but I don't remember the last time I read through all of Ezekiel. And so I'm here confessing to all of you who are here wanting to learn a little bit more about Ezekiel as we get into our sermon series, The Me We Want to Be. Mm-hmm. We wanted to give you guys an opportunity to get an overview of Ezekiel, about the story, about where we're entering into, because maybe you've read Ezekiel hundreds of times over the past few years. But if you're like me, who hasn't read through Ezekiel in a little bit, Josiah is going to explain everything, right? Everything, all the details, all the hard passages. You're going to explain it all for us, right?
That's right. You're going to walk away knowing everything from this.
Yeah, you have it memorized. I've been
absolutely.
told.
That's right. No, that's right. No, I kind of what you're saying. Something that's so good is like when you get that curiosity and the chance to jump into the word, you usually walk away with something you didn't expect, and it's usually better than you ever could have imagined, even if it at first seems intimidating. So. I love the word. I love jumping into it. But no, I'm not an expert in any of these things. I'm a student just like you. And we just want to give you a top-down 10,000-foot view of Ezekiel as we're headed into this new series.
Yeah, so the way it's going to work is I'm going to act as the person who knows nothing about Ezekiel. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to help us understand the answer to some of these questions that I feel like some of us might be having as we enter into this Ezekiel series. Okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. To be clear, I know all these answers already. I'll just pretend. Yeah. I'm just pretending.
You're doing
I don't know.
Them,
yeah,
really.
I know all the answers already. I went to seminary, but I'll just for this.
That's right.
For this exercise, I'm just pretending.
Thank you for being so humble. Really, you're blessing us here.
All right, Josiah. So the first question I have is, who is Ezekiel? Can you give us a better understanding of who he is as a person?
Yeah, so Ezekiel was a Jewish man. He was born in the town of Jerusalem and lived there. And when he was coming up towards his 30th birthday, not exactly yet, but towards there, this outside empire called Babylon shows up. And they attack Jerusalem, and they take him and some others into exile. They take them as refugees, prisoners of war. And then the book starts with Ezekiel sitting there in Babylon, in a town that he doesn't know.
So I think, can I just interrupt real quick?
Please do.
I actually think that is a key point.
Oh, yeah.
Just the fact that this story is really in the context of people, God's people being exiled and essentially refugees, as you mentioned. And I think just to be in that mindset as we enter into the book of Ezekiel is really important to understand and to know what's happening here. So I just wanted to reiterate that point because it's really essential, I think, to the story.
I think so too. And something I love about studying the word is when you jump into it, there are moments where you start to see the people that God chose to work through and seeing how God used their personality and their individualism in a way that explodes into the scripture. And we'll see that in Ezekiel, right? Because some of him comes out through this. But to answer your question, he was training to be a priest before he was taken into captivity into the Babylonian Empire.
And so now that we have a little bit of understanding of who Ezekiel was as a person, can you help us understand what is going on in the book of Ezekiel? Because if you've read it before, let's say you've done a Bible reading plan before, you read it, you might not fully understand like what's actually happening here. What are all these images? What are all these things that's happening? So can you give us a little bit of a better understanding of that?
That's a great question. So the book of Ezekiel starts with Ezekiel, this guy we were talking about, hitting his 30th birthday. And he was, at this point, 30 years old, and that culture meant you were going to be a priest, but he's in exile. He's sitting on this river, and he gets this vision from God. So the book starts with this wild vision from God. And we'll talk about why it's so wild in a minute. But then the point of that is that while he was living in Jerusalem, and actually at this point, when he receives the first vision, people are still in Jerusalem. Some of his people are still there. They're not all taken into captive. He was just of the first group. He sees that time and time again, as a community, they have done wrong. They've turned from God. They've broken their promise to him. And what he sees at the end of it is this heartbreaking image of the presence of God getting up and leaving. And he's left in a painful time and has to deliver an unwanted truth of, hey, we've turned from God, we've done wrong, and we need to change. So that's kind of how the book starts. And then from there, it goes big picture, right? And it talks about how actually the whole world needs to change. And there are aspects that this human condition, which it talks a lot about, is impacting the whole world, before in the final section, it then starts talking about, well, what's the hope there?
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the visions that are also happening along Ezekiel and maybe some of the themes of what Ezekiel's drawing out here? Because I think, as we've talked about before, there's a specific genre of literature that Ezekiel is. And so can you explain a little bit more about that too?
That's right. So when you pick up and read the Bible, what's important to know is that each book kind of has its own rules that it's playing by. We call these genres. The way that you would read a history book today is different than you would read a poetry book, right? You just know the rules of the genre. Yeah. This book is two main genres. One is prophetic, which means it's calling out. So think of like a Twitter post. It's calling out something that's bad. But it's also something called apocalyptic. This is where the weird stuff, the visions, the things you're not used to, come into play. And we see this in other parts. Like we see this in Revelation. Yeah. We see this in parts of Daniel. Yeah. And actually a biologist friend of mine came up with like the perfect way to explain this, right? So I'm going to totally steal this. When we go into a microscope and we look at something, we realize reality isn't exactly what it seems. We zoom in and we see that there are protons and neutrons and electrons, and it's just different. It's just as real, but it's different than what we first thought it looked like. If that's what happens when we zoom in, apocalyptic literature is what happens when we zoom out. When we see the spiritual component of what's happening from the big picture. So those moments where Ezekiel receives a wild vision that to us sounds, oh my goodness, how is that possible? What is happening? Part of it is symbolic, but the other part is he's seeing a spiritual reality that we all could see if we just simply were able to zoom out the way we could zoom in.
And I think that's actually, some of us don't really think of Ezekiel in that way, but it's interesting when you look at the book of Revelation and look at Ezekiel, there's a lot of parallels in them because they are pretty similar genres in certain aspects of the apocalyptic nature of it. But we don't always like think of Revelation and Ezekiel of saying similar things, but there are very similar parallels because of genre and the way that they're talking. So now can you draw us out a little bit, some of the themes that we need to know about Ezekiel? So as we're entering into it, there's all these things going on, but what is at the heart of it? What's the thing that God is trying to teach us? What is Ezekiel trying to reveal to us? What's something that we can be learning as we go through the book of Ezekiel?
Yeah, and this is kind of why I love the book of Ezekiel, right? Because there's no getting around it. There are passages that are different. There are passages that are maybe sometimes hard for us to read. But what I love about it is the fact that it's getting to the core question, which it's working on and trying to figure out is, what do we do in a world that's broken and we're the ones who are causing it? Like when we're actually the problem. And it uses this idea, this metaphor throughout it of hearts of stone. It's super interesting. That was used earlier on in the Old Testament to refer to the oppressors when they were living in Egypt. And the problem is now that their hearts are made of stone. And the question this book is really asking and getting at is, what do we do when we as humans don't measure up? We don't keep our promises. We don't always do what's right. We actually do what's wrong sometimes. What's the solution? And at first it seems kind of hopeless, right? Because in their understanding, when you didn't measure up, when you didn't have the ability to follow through on your promises, God, who had a covenant, it's like a promise with the Israelites, had every right to get up and leave. Yeah. And that's what we see in the first 3 chapters. You're broken, you messed up, God, he has the right, he can leave. But what's so powerful is when you get deeper into it, you realize that he actually left and went with them into exile. The direction that Ezekiel sees this presence of God get up and go is right where they were going, to Babylon. And the hope of this is that even in the midst of the brokenness of humankind, that we aren't perfect, God actually meets us right there. Yeah. Even if it is messy.
All right, Josiah, now where do we go from here?
You know, I would invite you all to lean into the curiosity. Jump into this book, read it, study it, question it, write notes. A friend of mine came up with this image where I don't know about you. I look on my phone for directions. So anytime I'm going somewhere, I just look it up on my phone and I follow that. And I've been living in, I probably shouldn't say this, I've been living in Massachusetts for like 2 years now. I still use my phone to get to like work.
Yeah.
I don't really know how to get to work all that well without my phone. And something that's super interesting though, is that if I ever get lost and if I ever don't know how to get somewhere and I have to figure it out on my own, not having a quick answer, but having to go through the journey of uncertainty, that's how I get to know someplace. That's how I get to know a town. That's how I get to know where to go next. And what I'm trying to highlight is that in our world, we see confusion and we see uncertainty and we see these challenges of like embracing a book you haven't read in a while and really diving into it. We see that as an obstacle or maybe even a hard thing, when actually I would make the case that those are necessary steps for us to truly learn something. So if you read through this and you go, what the heck is going on? I don't know what's happening. I'd actually say you're probably learning. And that's probably a good thing. So I would say lean in.
Yeah, that's so great. We actually also have some additional resources that you can find that will link all of this out. The Bible Project is one of the ones that is really helpful to give really big picture overview with some amazing graphics and animations that help us understand a bit about the story of Ezekiel as well. So feel free to dive into all these different things and learn a little bit, and we'll all learn together as we go through the sermon series together. And I hope, and our prayer is that this sermon series would be a blessing to you, that it would meet each and every one of you, the places that you are, that God would speak prophetically, powerfully into your lives. So we're excited for this sermon series, and I hope it becomes a blessing for all of you. So thank you so much for joining us. Josiah, thanks again for being here with us.
It's good being with you, John.
All right. Bye, guys.
Good to see you.